The navigation equipment fitted to the DC-10 was, in the late 1970s, considered to be state-of-the-art technology. Its correct title was an Area Inertial Navigation System. Comprising of 3 inertial sensor units, the purpose of each is to monitor, record and display every movement of the aircraft through space. The principle, if not the electronics, is relatively simple. The unit is told before departure exactly where it is on the Earth's surface, in the context of latitude and longitude coordinates. As the aircraft begins to move, accelerometers within the inertial units continuously record distance, direction and speed travelled. Thus, having an initial reference point to always refer back to, this continuous monitoring of the aircraft movement allows for the generation of an altered position in relation to that initial starting point. Hence, the unit maintains a constant, real-time update of where the aircraft actually is. This information is readily displayed to the crew via standard display unit in the cockpit. The reason for 3 independent units is essentially twofold. Firstly, units such as these are always prone to malfunction, hence a built-in level of redundancy. Secondly, slight manufacturing differences between the independent units means inevitably each will calculate a moving position slightly different from the other 2. Taking an average result from the 3 units acts to mitigate against these minor inconsistencies. As such, the units can operate completely independent of any external navigation aid. The crew during pre-flight will, as already mentioned, initialise the unit with the aircraft's current latitude and longitude. This is considered the initial waypoint of the resultant flight plan. To this initial waypoint are added a series of consecutive waypoints akin to a string of breadcrumbs, leading the aircraft all the way to the final waypoint, which defines the flight's destination. In practice, the data gathered by the INS unit may, at the pilot's discretion, be synchronised with autopilot operation. In other words, the INS may be locked into the steering of the aircraft, whereby it may be automatically flown from one waypoint to the next. It's important to stress, however, that in order for synchronisation to occur, the pilot must make a conscious effort to engage what is called the nav mode. Only then will the autopilot be slave to the INS output and steer the aircraft in the manner described. Collins' subsequent reliance on this very mode will be the focus of much debate as the Commission hears evidence. Throughout, a real-time latitude and longitude of the aircraft's current position is displayed to the crew, along with other selectable information, such as the along-track distance to the next waypoint. Should he so wish, the pilot can break this synchronization between autopilot and INS by selecting a lateral mode other than nav, for example heading. In this regard, the pilot, in selecting a specific heading for the aircraft to fly, will override and subsequently disengage the nav function. A practical example would be the pilot's desire to circumnavigate observed weather, as the pre-programmed flight plan will obviously have no understanding of exactly where the aircraft will potentially encounter weather. It follows that in nav, no strategic manoeuvring is possible, with the aircraft rigidly following the computed track from one waypoint to the next. In order to achieve this desired course correction, the pilot will take direct lateral control of the aircraft via the heading selector, circumnavigate as necessary, and when finished, steer the aircraft back on an intercept heading with the original course. Maintaining the desired intercept heading, the nav mode may be once again armed. Once the engagement criteria have been met, nav will again become the active lateral mode, and the aircraft will roll to acquire the pre-programmed route and once again continue on its way to the next identified waypoint. From Cape Hallett southwards, the aircraft have been flown on nav track, this being confirmed by the digital flight data recorder. Then, with the aircraft approximately 40 miles from destination, Collins found a large break in the clouds through which the sea ice was plainly visible. As duly recorded by the flight data recorder and confirmed by the CVR, Collins disengaged the nav track in order to bring the aircraft down through the large cloud break in 2 descending orbits, the objective here being to descend from 17,000 to 3,000 feet while still maintaining the same approximate distance from McMurdo. By using the heading select knob, the course of the aircraft was directed into 2 descending orbits. Then, as the aircraft straightened up at the conclusion of the second orbit on its heading select course, taking it approximately due south, Collins again armed the nav mode. Once the engagement criteria had been satisfied, nav mode again re-engaged, and the aircraft remained in this lateral mode until final impact with Mt.Erebus. The system is designed, as previously mentioned, to be capable of navigational computations independent of any external aids. This isn't to say that if present, external aids won't be used to fine-tune or verify the INS internal calculations. However, in truth, the accuracy of the device is extremely impressive. In a system with 3 internal sensors, as was the case with the DC-10, the maximum possible lateral error will be 1.153 nautical miles for each hour of flight, as the unit's error drift is proportional to the length of time it has been in use. But this is the maximum error allowed. In reality, the drift experience will be considerably less. In the case of 901, after a 5-hour flight from New Zealand, the aircraft had struck the mountain at a point only 1.2 nautical miles to the east of the programmed nav track, even though radio updating from external aids had obviously not been possible for the majority of this preceding 5-hour period. All of this, of course, is of vital significance when it's recalled that Captain Collins relied on the nav track mode to guide the aircraft on a course which he believed was taking him down the approximate centre of McMurdo Sound, which is approximately 40 miles wide, except at the point between Cape Royds and Cape Bernacchi, where the distance narrows for a mile or two to 32 miles before again widening to 40. Evidence given by operational pilots before the Commission will establish that on long flights from Auckland to Honolulu or from Singapore to Auckland, the INS system always brings the aircraft to its destination at a point which does not vary by more than a mile left or right of the pre-planned navigation track. As such, despite suggestions to the contrary, there can be no valid reason, having regard to the long experience of Captain Collins in flying DC-10 aircraft, for him to have been in any doubt about the accuracy of the flight path indicated by the INS as the aircraft approached the entrance to McMurdo Sound. Past experience had demonstrated that any ultimate position error on the part of the INS could not be more than a mile east or west, and as such a deviation was irrelevant, having regard to the flat plateau, 40 miles in width, down which the aircraft would fly towards its destination waypoint. In his summary, therefore, Mahan is definitive. The INS itself played no direct part in the loss of 901, and furthermore, given the extreme accuracy and reliability of the system, Collins was right to place his trust in where he believed the navigation calculations were taking him, and that, in his mind, was accurately on a track straight down the centre of McMurdo Sound. Confirmation of exactly where Collins believed engagement of the nav mode would ultimately take his aircraft came from an unlikely source. Mahan, while hearing evidence from Collins' family, learned that the night before the accident flight they had observed him review navigational charts and had sat with him while he discussed the proposed trip south to Antarctica.
He had a ruler or some measuring equipment and was working on a large chart of the Antarctic Ross Sea region. He indicated the path of the aircraft down the coast of Victoria Land to McMurdo Sound. I remember he mentioned flying over the Dry Valley area, and he indicated the aircraft would fly back from McMurdo Sound up the same coastline on its return flight. Do not recall him making any mention of Mt.Erebus. My father was working...
You've done very well, Catherine. Thank you both for coming in, helping us. Gary. That affidavits will be sufficient, David. They won't have to be called.
My husband would have spent between 1.5 and 2 hours working on these maps and materials at the dining room table. It was a reasonably frequent practice of his, to spend time in preparation of his flights, going over briefing materials, etc., particularly in respect of a new route that he hadn't flown before, or a route that he hadn't recently flown. He came back through from the girls' room about 9:30, 9:45, after tucking in Elizabeth and Catherine. I was looking at some publicity brochures as he packed up his maps and instruments. And at one stage, he came up behind me and looked over my shoulder. He was excited at the prospect of going down there. And he said something like, "Awesome, isn't it?" Expecting me to agree. I can remember just shivering and saying, I can't get enthusiastic over a hunk of ice and snow. I really can't.
Would you be good enough to answer any questions put to you by counsel?
Mr. McLaren?
Nothing, Your Honor.
Mr. Nicholson?
I have no questions.
Mr. McGrain?
No questions, Your Honor.
You may step down, Mrs. Collins.
Mann is now convinced that Collins relied on the false information given him at the briefing and plotted a flight track which he knew would take his DC-10 down McMurdo Sound over the flat sea ice well clear of Erebus.